Take a close look at this picture. It's a puzzle from the Soviet magazine Merzilka. There's a spy in the picture, and you have to figure out who it is. Pause the video, take a look, write your answer in the comments, and I'll reveal the answer in exactly 3, 2, 1. To be honest, I didn't guess it myself, but at that time, anyone from the village knew how to use a samovar and would not pour water into the chimney. Everyone also knew that the USSR was the largest country in the world in the 20th century. It covered an area of 22.4 million square kilometers, which, for a second, is the fourth largest country in history. The USSR occupied about 1/6 of the landmass, while modern Russia occupies about 1/7. It also had the longest border in the world, more than 60,000 kilometers. This is even longer than the circumference of the globe, as the equator is 40,000 kilometers long. At the time of its collapse, it had a population of 294 million. This was because the USSR was a union of Soviet Socialist republics and consisted of as many as 15 states. Initially, there were only 4, which signed the declaration on the creation of the USSR in 1922. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian SFSR. Over time, new ones joined them, and by 1956 the list was complete. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. It all began with the October Revolution in Russia, during which the Bolsheviks, or communists, seized power throughout the country. This was followed by a civil war, at the end of which a new state, the USSR, was formed. At that time, the Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, around whom a so-called cult of personality had been built up over many years. Every child knew him as the kind grandfather Lenin, who created the brightest and most indestructible state in the world. After Lenin's death, he was not buried, but a special mausoleum was built, where the leader's body was laid to rest, where it still lies today. Incidentally, there have been 2 attempts to blow up this mausoleum. In 1967 and 1973, many people were injured and even killed by terrorists. Lenin himself was also targeted for assassination on more than one occasion. He was shot at, even with a poison bullet, and attempts were made to blow him up. But none of these attempts were successful, and there were reasons for this, because he had changed his position quite significantly since coming to power. After his death, Stalin was also laid to rest in the mausoleum, but after a special policy to abolish the cult of personality around the leader, his body was removed and buried in the usual manner. Prisoners tattooed portraits of Lenin and Stalin for safety. They believed that guards were forbidden to shoot the leaders of the proletariat. During the Soviet Union, many goods were in short supply. This trend continued throughout almost the entire existence of the state. The reason was the centralized planned economy. The top brass gave production plans that failed miserably among the common people. This was due to many unaccounted factors. Things like poor management, lack of innovation, limited imports, corruption, and price controls that prevented the creation of a truly competitive environment. In short, it turned out that in one part of the USSR, meat was rotting, while in another, people did not have enough to eat. In one part of the USSR, there were buckets galore, while in another, where there was a dairy factory, there were not enough buckets. The system was far from ideal. A canteen system was introduced so that everyone would have enough food in conditions of scarcity. They looked like this. You could get food with them. For the same reason, products were also sold under the counter. There was a black market where you could buy bananas, chocolate, or other exotic items at astronomical prices. People had to travel from their cities to Moscow or another large city just for food. In fact, the food was very diverse. Here are a couple of interesting products: processed cheese, amber in tubes, jelly in briquettes, triangular milk cartons, Soviet chewing gum, delicious ice cream that was made strictly according to GOS standards and was so natural that it could only be stored for 10 days, but was considered a premium product in the rest of the world. Among beverages, one may recall pear-flavored soda, barberry, tarragon, cream soda, and bellflower. At various times, shortages also affected household appliances and household goods. If you walked down the street with several rolls of toilet paper, you would clearly be envied. Sanitary pads, like other feminine hygiene products, did not exist at all in the USSR. Yes, you had to make something similar yourself out of gauze and cotton wool. And that was if you could buy these things at a pharmacy. If there were no bandages, old underwear or t-shirts were cut up and sewn together to use as pads. It's funny that people had money, but there was nothing to buy. By the way, This is what the very first banknotes that appeared in the Soviet Union looked like. Then they were changed several times, reprinted, and redesigned, for example, into these. But the very last ones to be issued were these. Cars were also in constant short supply. You had to try very hard to be able to buy a car. The very first of all Soviet cars was the Nami one, which appeared in 1926. Engineers tried to combine everything they could in it, from a large number of seats for passengers to a right-hand drive and a 22-horsepower engine. 20 years later, the mega-popular Moskvich cars appeared, the first of which was released in 1946. The Moskvich 400 was in fact an exact copy of the Opel Kadett K38, but since its blueprints had not been preserved, Soviet engineers simply dismantled the cars themselves and made similar parts. In the 1960s and 1970s, production of the VAZ, or simple Zhiguli, began. At that time, the Soviet Union signed an agreement with Italy to produce its own cars based on the highly successful Fiat 124. At the same time, Kamaz and Niva trucks appeared, which are still in production today, but of course with a redesigned look. In the USSR, there was a real law against parasitism. Just like in Belarus today, there was also a tax levied on single, childless, and small family citizens. All Soviet men between the ages of 20 and 45 had to pay 5% of their salary to the state every month until they had a child. Women did not have to pay the tax until they got married. If a USSR citizen had a moonshine still in their apartment, they would receive a hefty fine the first time, a year and a half, in prison the second time, and 3 years for selling it. For buying, trading, or even storing foreign currency, you could get up to 8 years in prison. In addition, you could lose your place in line for an apartment. Yes, your place in line, because it was completely legal and possible to get an apartment for free from enterprises and the state. True, they were not issued immediately, and sometimes you had to wait several decades. In general, this practice became possible thanks to the construction of new apartment buildings in Khrushchev, which still stand in every city. Initially, they were planned as a temporary measure until more comfortable housing was built. But, as usual, something did not go according to plan. Khrushchev-era buildings were constructed very quickly, as they consisted of identical components. Thus, in just a couple of days, an entire building could be erected, like a construction set. So many were built that they accounted for 10% of the country's total housing stock. This allowed the state to solve the housing problem quite efficiently and quickly and provide housing for 80 million citizens. And of course, this move by the authorities inspired an incredible sense of respect and gratitude for their country among the people. Patriotism and related concepts were almost the basis of life in the USSR. From early childhood, everyone knew that capitalism was bad, that people in the US and Western countries lived terribly and much worse than in the bright USSR. A wave of patriotism swept across the country during the Great Patriotic War, which is of great importance even for modern Russia. Special propaganda posters were created, songs and slogans were composed, all so that the common people would go and defend their country. And even despite the heaviest losses during World War II, more than 25 million, the USSR was able to defeat Germany. Posters in the USSR are a separate topic for a video. Suffice it to say that they were an art form in themselves. They were drawn for political advertising, to promote the country's position, and for movie theater posters. And of course, they were a powerful means of propaganda. But they also reflected the skill of famous Soviet artists such as Dmitry Moore, Viktor Deny, Ilya Kranovsky, and others. They were also popular around the world. This is the most famous Soviet poster, according to many, The Motherland Calls, which appeared at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. Another super recognizable one is You Enlisted as a Volunteer, as well as No, dedicated to the fight against alcohol. Censorship in the USSR was extremely strict. Criticism of the political system, the government, the Communist Party, and its leaders was forbidden. Materials that could threaten state security were also banned. Censorship extended to literature, cinema, theater, music, and other forms of art. Foreign books and magazines that did not align with the official ideology were prohibited. As a result, many ideas and opinions were suppressed, and people could face repression simply for expressing their thoughts. Despite all this, after the war there was a sense of hope among the population, especially given the fact that the USSR was losing the space race at first. However, the Soviet Union won the opening round by developing the world's first multi-stage rocket, the R-7. In 1957, it launched the world's first artificial satellite into orbit. These decisive actions also forced the United States to establish NASA. Later that same year, In November 1957, the USSR became the first country to send a living creature into orbit aboard a spacecraft. That creature was a dog named Laika. Unfortunately, she did not survive the extreme conditions and never returned to Earth. 3 years later, in the early 1960s, 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, were sent into space and successfully returned alive. The United States launched its first animal into space only in 1961, and that mission was also successful. In response, the USSR delivered a crushing blow by sending Yuri Gagarin into space, the first human to ever do so. He orbited the Earth and landed safely, becoming a global celebrity overnight. He was invited to dinner by Queen Elizabeth II herself, as well as by presidents of many countries. Just 6 months later, another cosmonaut, German Tito, set a new record by spending more than a full day in space and returning safely. 2 years after that, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. Interestingly, after her flight, no woman left the planet again for nearly 20 years. The space rivalry between the USSR and the United States continued until 1975 and eventually ended with joint space exploration projects. Education in the Soviet Union was free, and after graduating from university, many people were assigned to work at factories or began careers in scientific research. The state guaranteed employment to every university graduate. One such graduate was Alexei Pajitnov, the man who created the most popular video game in the world. He worked at the computing center of the Academy of Sciences on artificial intelligence and speech recognition, while also experimenting with computer games and puzzles, eventually inventing Tetris. Overall, the USSR produced a huge number of impressive innovations, and technology was being developed everywhere. In 1967, the Soviet Union built the tallest freestanding structure in the world at the time, the Ostankino Television Tower in Moscow. Soviet cinema also kept pace. 3 domestic films won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film: War and Peace, Dersu Uzala, and Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. To put things into perspective, the Soviet adaptation of the Sherlock Holmes detective series is still considered the best in the world, even in the UK, the homeland of the famous detective. I've seen it myself, and honestly, it's excellent. The USSR also created the most famous assault rifle in the world, the AK-47. And if you think there were no subcultures in the Soviet Union compared to the United States, that's far from true. In the 1950s, the Stilyagi appeared, young people who imitated American fashion and culture. They were apolitical, something like Soviet hippies. Later, in the 1980s, Soviet punks emerged as well. They were also apolitical, wore mohawks. And well, punk was punk back then, just as it is now. In the Soviet Union, passports looked like this. Their quality was poor, and they wore out quickly. But once, this actually worked in the country's favor. The letters on the cover were embossed in gold and quickly faded over time. However, American spies were given passports that looked brand new. This detail alone led to the exposure of more spies than almost any other mistake. And the USSR was no passive player either. In 1945, Soviet schoolchildren gifted the American ambassador a wooden plaque made of valuable wood, featuring the U.S. coat of arms. Neither the children nor the ambassador knew that a listening device had been embedded inside. It was so cleverly designed that American intelligence agencies failed to detect it. Soviet intelligence managed to listen in on conversations in the ambassador's office for 8 years. What's more impressive is that the device operated without batteries. For a long time, the West couldn't figure out how it worked. The discovery was kept quiet. After all, how could one publicly admit such a major intelligence failure? Only in the 1960s did the Americans reveal the device, known as Project Slathouse, during an international scandal involving the downing of a U-2 spy plane. There were many such cases. For example, Aldrich Ames worked for the CIA for years before being recruited by Soviet intelligence, helping identify and eliminate 9 American agents in the USSR. There were even attempts to enter the U.S. Embassy under the cover of a fire, until U.S. Marines blocked the way and said, "Let it burn." There were also the cases of Rudolf Abel, Gary Powers, Anatoly Grigorenko, and many others. Despite the hostile relations, Americans and American culture were often admired. Marshal Zhukov, for instance, loved vodka and American Coca-Cola, and even requested a clear version of Coke so he wouldn't attract attention in public. The U.S. supplied cola to the USSR, and the Soviet Union supplied vodka in return. The USSR even produced its own whiskey, Whiskey 73, made from alcohol and imported flavorings, but no one really bought it. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist on December 8, 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine signed the Belavasia Accords, terminating the 1922 Union Treaty. Russia became the legal successor to all the debts and achievements of the former state. I decided to ask artificial intelligence, describe life in the USSR in 2 words, and here's what it replied.